Namaskar, it is a great pleasure to be delivering the valedictory address at this international symposium, a symposium that has attempted in diverse ways since yesterday to re-examine some of the trajectories that Indian historiography has taken since independence. In the spirit of things, therefore, what I will briefly attempt today is to speak of some challenges and opportunities that such an exercise entails, weaving the discussion around two wider conceptual questions, which, as we will see, relate in fundamental ways to both theory and praxis of history as an academic discipline. So I hope to do something of an expository talk today. Such a discussion will also perhaps address and bring together certain concerns that have been raised by other speakers yesterday and today, and you will recognize these in my talk. So what are these two larger fundamental questions that I think we should think about? The first is, what is history? For 200 years now, Indologists have not asked this, but another related question, that did we write history? Were ancient Indians and Sanskrit traditions in particular even capable of writing history in the midst of the abundance of spiritual, mythological, and aesthetic literature they produced instead? That's what we were told, that this became the central existential question about the Indian civilization, as it were. It would be fair to say that this question has been, perhaps naturally, one to dominate Indian historiography, resulting, however, only in various, what I think are defensive and epistemically ambivalent attempts to say that what we wrote was, for example, an embedded history, but not an overt one. So we have our back against the wall, as it were, when the question of history comes up, and we say, we want to claim we wrote history, and yet we must add these qualifiers that no, it was embedded, or it was of a different kind, it was a consciousness, but it was not actual practice, it wasn't a independent genre, and so on. What there has been no pause for reconsidering is this understanding of history itself that we are trying to fit ourselves into. A 19th century post-Enlightenment positivist understanding of history, in which not only were such ancient genres as the mythological and the aesthetic not historical, regardless of their cherished centrality to a continuous living civilization like India, but in this understanding, Rankian criteria, Rankian, as you all know, is from Leopold von Ranke, who was this philosopher of history who came to be very, very influential in defining this discipline. So Rankian criteria such as facticity, empiricism, rationality, scientific method, objectivity, these came to be deemed the only acceptable criteria of history. This inaugurated what Ethan Kleinberg rightly calls a disciplinary essentialism and a methodological fetishism at the heart of history. So it is important for us as practitioners of this discipline to first recognize this, to know the origins of the discipline, and also how it proceeded to establish this certain very narrow and hidebound, I would say, definition of what it is all about. What's more, this disciplinary essentialism emerged as enlightened modernity in Europe, but was transferred and experienced as colonial modernity in India and the rest of the world. Both modernism and colonialism thrived on a rejection of and a break with the pre-modern past of ancient indigenous societies and the values and priorities that these may have privileged. Born of this intellectual political moment, history thus may be said to have originated as a handy tool for the construction of cultural difference in the hands of empire. So history, in a way, as Makaranji was saying a little while ago, becomes this parameter by which you can divide the world and segregate those who are told that they never wrote history and just couldn't write it either. So history becomes a handy tool for the construction of cultural difference in the hands of empire, a tool that has long outlived empire itself in how it continues to exercise a hegemonic and exclusionary ambit the world over. The fact that it is exclusionary, I think, is of the essence, and I will talk more about this. Thus, it is against such parameters, the deep empiricism that underlies the global, intransigent definition of history, that scholars took to evaluating Indian texts and passing or failing them on the test of history, as it were. This began with the Orientalist and imperialist historians, all right, but was very much continued by mainstream Indian scholars since independence, in what can only be described as perhaps a scramble for co-equality with Western intellectual standards. Correspondingly, traditional Indian strategies of representation, such as myth, rhetoric, and didactics, were always found wanting, and they were shunned, inferiorized, and othered in a classic display of the coming together of, on the one hand, modernism's overweening anxiety for certitudes, mensurability, and empirical rationality rather than for the ethical value-based, and on the other hand, imperialism's objective of undermining and delegitimizing indigenous modes of knowledge production and transmission. One need only recall James Mill's scathing diatribe against Indian literary traditions for not measuring up to Judeo-Christian ones. And Professor Wink was talking about something similar, that the comparison is always an external standard rather than exploring the Indic civilization on its own terms. And while in India, among historians, the rhetoric is of radicalism, the reality seems to be of being in a continuing thrall Western definition of history that has since been rendered as a global one. Mind you, as Norbert Elias once put it, the West, when I say the West, it does not indicate a cardinal direction so much as a mindset, so that it could and it did have votaries anywhere in the world, including in our country. A case in point is what they did to Kalhan's Rajtarangini. This 12th century narrative of the royal dynasties of Kashmir over 2 millennia is a Mahakavya or Prabandha, that is, classic epic poetry in Sanskrit. It is better known, however, as history rather than poetry. In fact, the first and only work of history proper in all of Sanskrit literature, we are told, ever since it was partially translated into English in 1825 by the Orientalist Harold Wilson. This founding characterization of the text was confirmed by George Buehler later and his pupil Oral Stein, who produced the Rajtarangani's first critical edition and complete English translation in 1900. And what were these people so excited about vis-a-vis the Rajtarangani? Basically, what they perceived to be its very historical qualities, namely its overt reference to chronology, assigning dates in different eras for the ascension and end of every regime, its alleged quest for objectivity, mirrored in the poet's call to impartiality, and its display of causation, attributing events to explanations. Now, I have critiqued all of these points in the book. I won't go into that here, but what needs to be noted is that the features that made this text, to their mind, stand out in a literary culture otherwise infamous for its alleged poverty of historical sense. So, celebration of this one text was in fact based on the deprecation of an entire literary culture and civilization, from which the Rajtarangani was sought to be artificially segregated and disembedded as some sole exception. I have shown in the book that she is far from an exception. She is actually a deeply intertextual Indic text that brings together not only Itihas and Puran, but also Kavya, Shastra, Niti, Vanshadani. All of these are actually being brought together by this text, and perhaps there is where its iconicity may lie, rather than in being separate from or distant or departing from Sanskrit traditions. But that is not how it was perceived. That is not how it was discovered and celebrated by the Anglophonic historiographical world. These are all reasons why it is so necessary to contest this empiricist reading of the Rajtarangani as history, and to contest the very project of history that underlaid it. But contested it was not. Indeed, much later, in the 1960s, Indologists like A.L. Basham and R.C. Majumdar were saying the same things in praise of the text that their forebears had been saying. See, for example, this representative statement. Quote, even a modern historian should have little hesitation in ranking Kalhan as a great historian for his correct appreciation of the true ideals and methods of history, unquote. This is R.C. Majumdar. True ideals and methods of history. And this is what became canonical. This is exactly how Kalhan continues to be taught in classrooms in India till today. There was just one problem in this glowing appraisal of the Rajtarangani. All these scholars found themselves stumped by other aspects of the text that did not fit their idea of what history should be. Aspects which they then had to disown and described as, quote, failings and imperfections. So suddenly the same Sanskrit scholar who is the ideal modern historian develops these failings and imperfections. Thus, Stein thought that the rhetoric and didactic parts of the Rajtarangani that were in Kavya style were simply unconnected with the narrative proper, which was historical. He actually also edited out some of these parts, saying, oh, these are too Kavya-like. The fact that the entire text is a Mahakavya, so that those pure poetic descriptions or passages are not redundant to the text, did not cross his mind. Because the idea that this is a work of history and that is all that should be projected in the text led him to actually edit out and bracket out parts that he thought just didn't fit in. While Buehler indicted the resort to legend and myth in the Rajtarangani as rendering the chronology of a large part of the text valueless, quote unquote. So chronology is a great thing in the Rajtarangani, but chronology is valueless in the Rajtarangani. You see the contradictions in this, within this understanding of the Rajtarangani as history itself. He also thought that the author was very suspect. Kalhan was very suspect for drawing on legend and myth suddenly in the middle of what they were otherwise thinking is this very proper historical narration. Following suit, despite christening Kalhan a great historian, Majumdar spoke of his, quote, very defective method. I'm quoting from within the same piece written by Majumdar on Kalhan. And what did this very defective method consist in? What were Kalhan's cardinal sins? Inclusion of mythical or legendary kings, a blind faith in the epics and Purans. So drawing on what were perceived to be the traditional repository of knowledge in the Indic ecumene suddenly became a sin. A belief in witchcraft and magic, explanation of events as due to the influence of fate rather than to any rational cause. I'm quoting throughout. A didactic tendency, so even this is a problem. A didactic tendency inspired by Hindu views of karma. And finally, mere display of poetic and rhetorical skill, mere display. So poetics and rhetoric rendered as is essentially sterile constructs, essentially just meant for indulgence and pleasure rather than being meaningful symbolic constructs. And I have argued in my other books that that is exactly how aesthetics need to be read. They were actually meaningful constructs that are trying to render certain representations of a variety of historical phenomena, whether it's urbanism or regional history and so on. Based on this vantage, both Majumdar and Basham maintained that the first three Tarangas, the first three books of the Rajtarangani, it consists of 8 books, were less credible than the last 5. So did Romila Thapar in the 1980s, who taught us to distinguish between what she called earlier books, where supernatural causes and fate were important, and later books that reflected, we were told, quote, the maturity of Kalhan's historical thinking. So suddenly the same author comes into his own within one single text. This is a separation between the earlier books and the latter ones that continues to inform modern readings of the text. Thapar also dismissed Kalhan's moralism and didacticism as some kind of Brahmanical vestige. Philologists and historians who dominated the study of the Rajtarangani thus ended up fragmenting it, splintering it, setting up some parts of it against other parts, as it were, obfuscating rather than elucidating the nature of the text as a whole, and not seeing it on its own terms. Moreover, all aspects of figuration proper to a poetic discourse were deemed extraneous and detrimental to the essentially historical substance and intent of Kalhan's enterprise. And this historical intent was presumed antithetical to the poetic. And this is the methodological issue I want to draw your attention to. This binary that has come to pervade the discipline of history, that the literary and the poetic, especially when these are ancient works of writing, that these stand in a binary opposition to history. They cannot be history. Whereas I submit to you that this is entirely inspired from modern post-Enlightenment, as I said, objectivist notions of history in the West, rather than from any indigenous or ancient approaches to treating of the past. Because this underlying belief, this fundamental belief, a kind of core tenet of history, this belief in the opposition of factual or true history and fictive or false literature, this was new even to 19th century Europe. It was the creation of this moment because it belies the practice even in classical antiquity, in ancient Greece and Rome, where history was considered but a form of fine literature with no prejudice to its truth value. So if you wrote ornate and beautiful literature, that does not compromise the truth value of a text. This is something that the modern discipline of history was reluctant to accept, especially about ancient works. And I will say more about this alternative historical vision that, according to me, can be founded on poetics in just a moment. But as things stood with the Rajtarangani, what we find is that positivism, to speak sweepingly, positivism mingled with imperialism, end up downgrading and delegitimizing indigenous narratives of the past. In being isolated as a flawed exception in all of Sanskrit literature, the Rajtarangani as objectivist history was both the creation and victim of an intellectual approach that sought to simultaneously appropriate and undermine a traditional Sanskrit text. So it is both celebrated, but is also essentially being victimized. It is being both appropriated and being judged, evaluated, and undermined. And what is additionally interesting is that this was subscribed to by scholars across the ideological board, from Orientalist to nationalist, Marxist, and other materialist historians, attesting thereby perhaps both the lure and the hold of positivism in Indian academia. So this is something that I'm flagging. Now, I have critiqued at length the major errors of category executed by this modern reinvention of the Rajtarangani. With regard to chronology, the Rajtarangani is certainly not the first, nor is she unique in giving these chronological order to her narration. Myth and causality, I have shown how these were also legitimate modes of historical representation within this text. Objectivity, poor E.H. Carr, it's been, 70 years now since he cried himself hoarse that objectivity is a preposterous fallacy. I'm quoting him, a preposterous fallacy in history. That is just not possible. And yet, perhaps because it continues to be this modernist aspiration of historians, so we also continue to look for it in texts to say, yes, this ancient text was history, or no, it was not. So I have actually critiqued each of these in the book. And what this did was this divesting of the Rajtarangani of all poetic features and recurrent tendencies like rhetoric, like didactics, that were true to the traditional Sanskrit that she was. So I have critiqued all of this there, because this spawned an understanding of the text that was in fact divorced from its own literary culture and logic. So it was a fundamental act of disembedding a text from its literary culture. And after that, all hell breaks loose, because no wonder that they misread it so completely and then got caught up in their own misreading of it, because we saw that this understanding of Rajtaranganiya's history turned out to be collapsible under its own contradictions. So they were giving compliments to the right hand and having to take them back with the left. I don't have time to go further into this critique today, but perhaps I have said enough already to highlight how the mainstream understanding of history in India seems to be predicated on positivist valorizations and a concomitant rejection of traditional Indian modes of historical engagement. This is why I propose that we have been asking the wrong question, that did we write history? The question that really needs to be asked is, what is history? And this needs to be informed by an aspiration for a truly global, decolonized knowledge order, which embraces answers from the global south. In this case, from the Indic ecumene, which may actually offer alternative, more holistic historical visions which serve functions and prioritize values possibly far removed from what Euro-American modernity may allow. It's high time that such visions of history are also taken on board. And this is not a call, I have to say this, this is not a call out of some kind of nativism or jingoism or chauvinism, but an acknowledgement of the plurality that in fact inheres in global ideas of history across the world. An epic diversity that has been papered over by what we have today, which is a hegemonic intellectual world order. It would be incomplete after having said this, because we can all talk about decolonization, but what really counts is demonstrating how this may be possible. So it would be incomplete to not go into what this alternative Indic vision and strategies of history may have consisted in. So let me say something briefly about this. I study Sanskrit poetry and drama, which is also Kavya, and I argue that at striking variance with modern historians, the ancients conceived of Kavya as an ideal historical mode, calling it Deepam Bhutavastu Prakashakam, the lamp that illumines past matters or past realities. And why not? Because continuing a Vedic tradition explicated in the 5th century BCE Nirukta, across 1500 years thereafter, Kavya theory or Alankara, within this Kavya theory, they obtained an enormous cultural investment in the poet or the Kavi as the Kranta Drishta, the true seer, and his privileged epistemic insight and authority that extended to matters past. So here we have this figure of epistemic authority, and that is the poet or the Kavi. Thus, Kalhan, in a metapoetic and self-reflexive vein, echoes many a Sanskrit rhetorician and poet before him, like Bana, Kuntaka, Anandvardhana, and Abhinav, when he speaks of the Kavi being able to gauge the true nature of all things, Sarva Samvedyan Bhavan, something that others can't see, poets can actually see. And by see here, see is symbolic. Darshana, Drishti, Darshana. So Darshana means philosophy, but why? Because it consists in being able to truly see through reality and see the true nature of reality. So the Kavi is actually partaking of this cultural understanding, which typically is associated with spiritual figures like yogins. In fact, some works of Sanskrit poetics explicitly compare the Kavi with the Rishi and says that the only difference is they both have darshana or drishti. The only difference is Kavi also has varnana, powers of description. And that's putting it so pithily, actually, because that's exactly what's going on. So Karan spoke of the Kavi being able to gauge the true nature of all things by virtue of his poetic intuition, pratibhaya. As he puts it, quote, who else is capable of making visible pratyakshata, bygone times, except the poet creator, Kavi Prajapati or Kavi Vedhas, who produces delightful productions, Ramya Nirman, unquote. So here is a clear statement of the quintessentially historical function of rendering the past, and that too in a recognizably constructivist understanding of history, which renders it as a production, nirmana. So Sanskrit poetry is recognizing that history is the production or work of the poet historian and is not an empirical given. It is not some foreclosed empirical given. Moreover, I also argue that for the Sanskrit poet, writing history did not exhaust truth. Ethicizing reality by narrativizing it was more the goal. This definition of history that we modern historians have entirely missed and failed to reclaim, busy as we have been chasing a culturally inappropriate and narrow view of history, this endogenous definition of history invested with cultural function seems to have been very clearly theorized and articulated in early India. Why do I say this? Witness this explicit and self-assured, very self-assured definition, no internal contradictions. This definition widely quoted by the Indian epics and the Puranas. What do they say? Dharmartha kama mokshanam upadesha samanvitam katha yuktam puravrittam itihasam prachakshyate. What does this mean? Narrations of the past, puravrittam, that are in story form, katha yuktam, so the narrative, and equipped with upadesha, instruction. In what? Dharma, artha, kama, mokshana. So, piety, power, pleasure, and liberation. That is called itihasa, or history. So, dharmartha, kama, mokshana, upadesha, samanvitam. So, upadesha, the didactic function of history is clearly stated. The form that history ought to take is also given, that it's a narrative form about the past. And that what does it instruct in? It instructs in the four ends of man, the four ends of humanity, as it was understood by them. So here is a very clear historical vision, which is an alternative to this modern empiricist one. And yet it has hardly been entertained. It has had to actually struggle to find recognition in terms of, the Itihas Puran tradition, or, bracketed out. The Indic vision of history has forever been bracketed as this exotic niche understanding of history. Why? I say that it's time that the envelope be pushed on the discipline of history itself. That such alternative understandings of history, whether it's from India or other parts of the global south, actually now let them inflect the modern discipline of history. Let them break through the disciplinary essentialism that I talked about earlier. Indeed, Kavya's own stated objectives, right from Bharata, his Natyashastra, through Bhama, Bhoja, down to Abhinav. According to them, Kavya's objectives went well beyond aesthetic. So this is another problem with historiography of India, that this entire realm of poetic and aesthetic literature was simply denied as historical because they said this is about aesthetics only, and aesthetics in turn are only about pleasure and entertainment, and they are not about historical representation at all. And I, right from my first book, which was in cities in Sanskrit Kavyas and came out 12 years ago, through all of my works have been actually showing how aesthetics were meaningful semantic codes, that they actually are conveying a meaning and not just the form, the ornate form of culture. So I have shown and argued for long that Sanskrit Kavya's own theory says that Kavya's objectives went beyond the aesthetic to the deeply mimetic and didactic. And the words that I use, the expressions that I use in rhetoricians I named, are lokasya anukaranam, imitation of the world, as mimetic as it gets, and upadesha or adhyayam. And let me quote Abhinav Gupta to seal the deal when he says, quote, the end result of the savoring of rasa is aesthetic flavor. So the end result of the savoring of rasa is instruction in dharma and the other ends of humanity, unquote. So what I'm saying is that at the heart of Sanskrit aesthetics was an insistent theory of socio-ethical pedagogy. And this should not surprise us at all, given the deeply intertextual, semantic and conceptual universe that Sanskrit poetry inhabited. So that different Sanskrit genres actually were speaking to each other and informing each other, whether it was Kavya or Shastra or Niti or Vanshavali or Purana. They are all actually bouncing off each other. What to my mind seems to be my sense is that there is this larger cultural understanding of what constitutes the true nature of knowledge and the true nature of reality ultimately, and the different cultural forms such as poetry on the one hand, or dance and sculpture and aesthetics, or even some branches of science and mathematics are all about ultimately striving towards that cultural ideal or that cultural aim, which typically ends up being more or liberation. Let's come back to Kavya. This didacticism that I'm talking about, this pedagogy, why is it relevant to the question of history? Because it framed not only the rhetorical, but the historical agenda of Sanskrit poetry, where time was conceived as a laboratory for overarching ethical principles governing social behavior to play out. In fact, the coalescing of didactic with historical functions via poetry meant that the model of epistemic truth generated by Kavya was both transcendent in invoking higher ethical aims, contingent in so history and ethics are coming together. And thus it is that Kalhan's documentation of umpteen figures and events from Kashmir's history is also, as I have shown in my book, crucially organized around certain ethical principles that constituted, according to him, true knowledge of time and human action. Thus, the centrality of dharma and karma to the Rajtarangani. And I like to define dharma and karma not in the typical ways that these are debated to be, but I like to define these as a certain critical idealism and a call to action, because that is, to my mind, how Kalhan actually replays dharma and karma. He is constantly invoking a critical idealism, and he demands this not only of the kings he talks about, but he demands this high standard of ethical behavior of every character, of every class and background that he talks about. So I personally think there is a very deep humanity that shines through Kalhan's work and which has been completely missed by historians. In fact, they call it his cynicism. They think he's being cynical when he's attacking this king or that for being a debauch or whatever it is. I don't think it's cynicism at all. I think it's a very deep-rooted concern for orthopraxis, for right conduct, rather than for orthodoxy. So I was saying that hence we have the centrality of dharma and karma in the Rajtarangani, but more so the centrality of the ultimate ethic. And what is the ultimate ethic? It is detachment. Detachment from worldly pursuits and power in an ever-changing, fluctuating, asthai is the word he uses, and therefore illusory world. So an ever-changing and fluctuating world is also an illusory world, and we know this from all the very many hegemonic works on Vedanta and on Advaita and Buddhism itself, which talks about which is so deeply nihilistic, which talks about how nothing exists for more than a moment, the momentariness, the shunyata, essential shunyata of reality, and the momentariness of everything else. So you can see again the intertextuality that is speaking through Kalhan, that's shining through Kalhan and informing his historical vision, actually providing a denouement to his historical vision. So what does he say? Quote, and it's just one example I'm giving you. There are very many in the text, and they're all in the book. But he says, even after realizing the transient nature of existence, gyatva api asthayim sthitim, fools do not give up ambition. Mudhaha prarudim mudchanti, seduced as they are by the attractions of treacherous fortune. Droha Shri Lobha Mohita. But on the same path of death is every individual plunging headlong. I am the slayer and he the slain. The notion of a difference between the two lasts but a short while. He who but yesterday exults while slaying his foe, at the end sees an enemy gloating over him when he is himself about to be killed. How awful! Fie on this illusion. Thick aho I am andhyava. Unquote. Here is a profound deposition on temporality itself. In fact, he prescribes the Rajtarangani in his Prayojana, which is the beginning of the text, as an antidote. The word he uses is bheshajya, which is a medicine or a remedy, as an antidote for ullase hrase va desha kalayo. That is, times of expansion and contraction, of ascent and decline in human fortunes. So what we are getting is history as not just documentation of, but also panacea for the inherent instability of life. So here is the deep cultural function and value assigned to history, which goes far beyond the simple, mere act of putting together a large number of facts. So we have a recognition of that fundamentally historical quality of time change. You see? So historical change or diachronicity is something that modern historians love to talk about, but here's this man in the 12th century who's already pointing it out. And he's doing it not from some disciplinary point of view, but because the larger cultural understanding of time is this, that it is replete with change and instability. So you're getting one, a recognition of this historical character of time in Kalhan, and two, the overlaying on that understanding of time of the archetypical Indic soteriological solution, namely adopting equanimity, samatva, and detachment, vairagya, which are represented in literary theory as the Shanta Rasa, or the aesthetic of equipoise and quiescence. So Kalhan actually states this right in the beginning of his text, that he has composed this work in the Shanta Rasa, his choice out of 9 rasas. It's a different matter. All the rasas show up in the text during his narration, but he's giving you the sign from this hint that this is the larger purpose of this text, and therefore of his endeavor to pen this history of Kashmir. So, as represented by the emblematic Rajtarangani, the Indic historical vision consisted in the coming together in the coming together. So it's not an opposition or choice. It's a coming together of empirical and ethical functions, which poetry was culturally mandated to deliver, providing a discursive and commentarial effect to history and a transcendental value over and above a merely documentarial one. So that is all about the first question I wanted to put to you, which is, what is history? And can we come up with endogenous understandings of history that, in a way, address and heal and reconcile many of the internal contradictions and deep epistemic problems in the modern understanding of history, which makes this modern understanding of history so ill at ease, such difficult bedfellows with Indic traditions. The answer is not to be defensive about the Indic traditions, but to in fact interrogate the origins and the lineages of the modern global understanding of history itself. I will be quick with the second half because I just about a certain amount of time to speak. The second conceptual question I want to raise today, after what is history, is what is India? When we speak of Indian history in this symposium, or when we offer courses on it in our universities, what are we talking about without first clarity on the question, what is India in the first place? Now, obviously, I don't need to ask about the India that came into being in 1947. I ask about the India that preceded 1947 by 5 millennia. What is that India? And why have we in mainstream academia, but for a few exceptions like Radha Kumud Mukherjee long back and B.D. Chattopadhyay more recently, why have the rest of mainstream academia shown such reticence in engaging with this fundamental question that what is India before the British came? As if there was something inherently reactionary or chauvinistic about exploring this question. Why does India have to bear the burden of these associations with asking the question that what is the pre-modern history of India? What is the pre-modern idea of India? Why does it automatically become something that is to be averted and avoided and shunned? That's something to think about. I think you will agree that academic reactions to such a question today, that what is India, typically range from either taking India as an unexamined given category or denying its very existence before the British colonized us. Now, latter, denying the existence of an idea of India before the British, is perhaps a more serious historiography. Because, as we will see, it chooses to ignore or silence rather too vast a body of evidence that does attest the existence of a clear pre-modern idea of India. And I'll talk about this. But when there is so much evidence, why then is there this denial of an idea of India in pre-colonial times? Now, one reason is, again, this modern myopia and hubris that preempts looking back beyond the colonial disjuncture. Because the experience of colonialism is seen to be defining of everything that India is today. And this is as great an irony as there can be, surely, for such a continuous living civilization as we are. Is India really nothing but the product of the colonial disjuncture? Significant though it was, I mean, overwhelmingly transformative though that colonial disjuncture was, but is that all India really is? A second reason for this reticence or denial of pre-modern India is clearly a direct hangover of colonial politics and historiography, whether we are thinking Mill or Macaulay or Sir John Strachey, who used to teach the Indian civil services, the Indian imperial services at that time, and tell them in so many words that there never was and there is not anything called India. So it is a hangover of colonial politics which prided itself in this instrumentalist disinformation that there never was an India. But the third reason, and the reason that is actually proffered by modern Indian historians today, if you put this question to them, people who deny the existence of an India before the British somehow hammered us into shape, the reason they give you is that, listen, India has always been too vast and too diverse to ever be one unified entity. That it was what one scholar has called an unnatural nation. And it is only modern developments, such as British rule first and the freedom movement, that forced a diverse and disconnected bunch of regions and peoples into one artificial and unhistorical entity called the Indian nation. This is what we are told. In other words, a country as sprawling and heterogeneous as India could never have been considered one. And all attempts since 1947 to forge a unified nation have been nothing more than a precarious statist project, rather than the culmination of a long and rich past. I think the political, ideological undertones to such a position are self-evident and they don't need laboring. But let this be the opportunity for a display of some epistemic courage. Because the irrefutable fact is that despite the enduring colonial legacy, there are astonishing convergences over 2 millennia in the way that a disparate set of historical commentators and observers attest a readily recognizable idea of India. And further, most remarkably, this idea that we see across 2 millennia from such disparate voices is seen to embrace, with no apparent sense of unease, both India's spatial unity, despite her vastness, as well as her incredible diversity. Now, this will sound familiar to most of you who are conversant with the claims of India's nationalist movement leading up to 1947, the whole slogan of unity in diversity. But what I want to draw your attention to is that it is not the invention of that movement. You actually get statements to this effect from 2000 years before the nationalist movement. And let me quote them for you. We have pre-modern Indian texts that put out this inclusive vision of what India is ages ago. And it is time we acknowledge and explore this remarkable phenomenon instead of villainizing any attempt to go into this. Let me just summarize this. We've written extensively and spoken about it before, but just some markers for those of you who may not be familiar with the lay of the land. Perhaps the earliest text to define India, Bharatvarsha, broadly yet resonantly as the land between the Himalayas and the sea, is the Hori Mahabharata. I'm not going into the issue of dates, but we know that it is well into the BCE. In particular, I draw your attention to the Bhishma Parva's Navamadhyaya, which details in over 70 verses. First, it's a very self-conscious discussion. So you see, they are not shy of asking this question right at the beginning, that what is India? What is Bharatvarsha? But we have developed this tremendous reticence about engaging in this question. So the Mahabharata gives 70 verses to asking what is this Bharatvarsha? And it details first the geography and then the ethnography of Bharatvarsha, which means the Janapadas, that is the communities and the peoples that inhabited Bharatvarsha, are given in such mind-boggling detail that it actually led a scholar to say that the Mahabharata is really the first anthropology project, perhaps anywhere in the world, the kinds of details that are given. Now, incredibly, these Janas, these communities that the Mahabharata is enumerating, included everyone you can think of, from the people of Kashmir, Gandhar, Cambodia, and Punjab, to Vidarbha and Malava, and from Kashi, Magad, Odisha, Bengal, Assam, to Dravida, Kerala, Karnataka, Kuntala, which is Telangana, and the Cholas. It's naming you these 2,500 years ago. And it's also naming, it's including in its list of Janas who constitute Bharatvarsha, Mlechas and Yavanas on the one hand. That is, the Greeks and the outsiders, so to speak. And on the other hand, tribes, such as the Nishadas, Shabaras, Kiratas, and Abhiras. There is also an explicit reference to all the four castes inhabiting Bharatvarsha. So they're all named as belonging to this country. In this great Indian epic's testimony, no conflict is seen between the spatial unity and identity of India and its inherent diversity and plurality. Instead, there is a free and frank acknowledgement of India's geographic and ethnic complexity and reality. This is seen rather than any exclusionary vision of India, that this is the land of only these people or that. No such thing. Again, in the Vishnu Puran, which comes later than the Mahabharata, we have the following saying: Uttaram yat samudrasya himadresya dakshinam varsham tad bharatam nam bharati yatra santatihi yojananam navasahasram tu dvipo ayam dakshinottarat purve kirata yasyante pashtine yavanaha sthitah. The country north of the sea and south of the Himalayas is Bharat, and her children are Bharati. So naming the people as well as Bharati and not just a landmass. 9,000 yojanas from north to south. It has Kiratas in the east and Yavanas in the west. So it's giving you the boundaries of this place. Now, who are the Kiratas? They refer to denizens of Assam and the eastern Himalayas, while Yavanas refer to those who settled in Greater Punjab. So can there be a more explicit and inclusive self-understanding of India? And in this understanding further, what is the preeminent characteristic of this land? Not that it is the land of this faith or that community, but that it is the only land of karma. Karma bhumir yam on the entire planet. What a mind-boggling definition of the country, and how modern really. Meaning it is the land of action by which people can ascend to heaven or hell or moksha, that is, make their own destinies. Now, this explicitness in what India is and this inclusivity are found articulated again in the 6th century. The encyclopedic Brihat Sanghita. This text, again, in more than 20 verses, exhaustively enumerates. You really have to see these original texts to understand the surprise. Exhaustively enumerates the many regions and peoples that were part of India. Again, they mention, among others, Kashmir and Peshawar in the north, up to Dravidas, Kerala and Karnataka down south, while Assam, Odisha and Bengal the east and Saurashtra in the west, and a whole lot of others in between. So the sheer clarity and detail of this idea of India as a unity through her plurality. So there's no fighting shy in these texts of her plurality. They don't see it as anything to be to cause unease. They actually see it as very consistent with this unity as well. And coming as this is from 1500 years ago, it is mind-boggling. Yet we don't teach this. There's no mention of this in our classrooms, and usually not even in the kind of research we do. The crux of the matter is that the view that India was too vast and diverse to ever be one pure nation ignores the fact that the pre-modern Indian concept of country or nation could well recognize and embrace that vastness and diversity. And how remarkable is that? We talk of cultural pluralism today, we talk of multicultural societies today, but here is a recognition of that, a clear statement of that from so long ago. And so this concept of India, this pre-modern idea of India, could well recognize and embrace this vastness and diversity both, and acknowledge alongside a common unified sphere of cultural circulation. So it's talking about, is alluding to a common unified sphere of cultural circulation. What do I mean by this? I think there's no better illustration of this idea of India that is both diverse and unified, both multiple and unitary, than the stellar Shankaracharya, a seer intellectual who established the supremacy of trans-sectarian Vedanta Dvaita. Now, Vedanta Dvaita, as you know, talks about a unified consciousness beyond multiplicity and form. Now, what did Shankara do? Why do I say he exemplified this vis-a-vis India? Starting from his hometown, Maladi in Kerala, Shankara is said to have undertaken 3 famous Digvijayas, tours of philosophical conquest of the land, intensely debating and defeating the varied local scholarship, right from Kapalikas, these are named in the text, Kapalikas and Pashupatas, to Mimamsikas, Vaishnavas, Shaktas, Jainas, and Buddhists. And all, first in Tamil Nadu, then Andhra, Vidarbha, and Karnataka, whereafter he reaches Gujarat, onwards to Ujjaini, Bahalika, Shurasen, Mathura, Daradas, which is Gilgit and Baltistan, Kuru Panchal, Punjab, Haryana, and then Kamarupa, Gauda, Bengal, and Koshala, UP. These are some of the places named. The fitting culmination of these Advaitic travels of Shankara was always each time. Where? In Kashmir. At the renowned center of all learning, the Sharada Peeth, which is described as the Sarvagya Peeth in the Shankara Digvijaya. That is the seat of omniscience. But today, of course, it's lying derelict across the line of control in POK. Indeed, the Shankaracharya temple at Srinagar still stands witness to this epic visit to Kashmir, or the memory of this epic visit to Kashmir, has also to the incredible centrality of the far north of India to the imagination of its far south, and vice versa. So Shankara actually epitomizes the centrality of the different extremities of India to each other's imagination. Otherwise, why does this man set out to do this? There's no other reason except for the definite existence of a unified sphere of cultural circulation that is India. Shankara's choice reflects that. His choice of movement reflects that. Of course, famously, he also inaugurated these 4 mathas in, again, 4 cardinal directions. Why is he doing this? What is he speaking to? He's not some emperor. He's not someone who's trying to unify the country politically. So why is he doing this? He's clearly speaking to, he's clearly responding to a well-known, a well-acknowledged understanding of what constitutes the Indian ecumene. So I believe that Shankara's pan-Indian voyages rather subtly demonstrate this ancient idea of India. A sphere peopled by great diversity of thought, but unified by a consciousness which pierced through the multiplicity. Very quickly, by the 14th and 16th centuries, the name changes. So it's not just Bharatvarsha or Hindu or other things now. It changes to Hind and to Hindustan in Amir Khusro and then in Abul Fazl, for example. But the reference point is very much the same territorial and cultural entities that their forebears had already attested. See, for example, what Abul Fazl says in the Ain Akbari, quote, "The sea borders Hindustan on the east, west, and south. In the north, the great mountain ranges separate India from Turan, Iran, and China." So a clear understanding of not only what is India, but also what is not India. And he says, intelligent men of the past have considered Kabul and Kandahar, please note, not the Indus River, Kabul and Kandahar as the twin gates of Hindustan. By guarding these, Hindustan obtains peace from the alien raiders. Unquote. The Tibetans, on the other hand, call India Ragyar or Fagzyul, the source country of their Buddhist masters. Their works like Lama Taranath's 16th century history of Buddhism in India or later 18th century works, they all mention gurus from Fagzyul belonging to where? What is their understanding of Fagzyul? It is Kashmir and Peshawar to Andhra and Kanchipuram, Saurashtra and Bengal. Their gurus all coming from Fagzyul are coming from such places. So they have no ambiguity about what this land, this Fagzyul is. And much earlier, I didn't have the time to list this for you, I've written about it, much earlier, a host of foreign accounts of travelers to India, right from Megasthenes, Ptolemy, to Al-Biruni, and Xuanzang, all of them attest a very similar and clear understanding of what India is. And they use somewhat different names for her. So Indica, Indoi, Intu is what Swanson says, Tien Chen, and so on. So what is the point I'm getting at? I'm saying thus on view again and again is staggering evidence over an enormous span of time and a variety of contexts of astonishing convergences in the perception or knowledge of what India was, by whatever name you called her there, Bharatvarsha, Hindu, Hind, Indoi, Ragyal, Falgzul, Hindustan, many different names, but all talking about the same, broadly the same area and the same people. So they're not necessarily identical in every respect, nor coterminous with present-day boundaries. So we have to be very clear. I'm not trying to mix up the present with the past. The fact that there seems to be a great deal that continued to be held in common in the idea of India across the centuries by Hindus, Buddhists, Muslims, and Jainas, by residents as well as by foreign travelers. So two kinds of perception. By pilgrims, poets, and chroniclers, itself deserves to be explored, deserves to be historicized. To deny these traditions of continuity where they may exist, even in the midst of so much historical movement and change in an ancient continuous living civilization like India, is surely to put a very riven politics above the pursuit of history. But history cannot be, this is something else I want to flag and I feel quite passionately about, history cannot be the study of only change. It cannot deny the continuities, it cannot suppress or brush away the continuities. Where there are civilizational continuities, that is not tantamount to being ahistorical. I have argued that those are actually trans-historical movements and traditions. And that tradition of preserving such continuity itself needs to be historicized. Finally, there is a second dimension to the historiography of this question of what India is. Clearly, it existed as a distinctive whole, but also we may ask, what is India in terms of its relation to its parts? This is a fairly contentious issue today. Regional identities, sub-regional identities versus national identity and so on. Now, when you ask this question of history, of the ancient or the medieval times, then typically you get one of two extreme reactions. You will either hear people talking of hegemonization, sweeping Sanskritization, earlier Aryanization. So you hear of this at one end, or the other end. You hear of complete autonomy and insularity of regions from the Indic mainstream. Kashmir, again, is a case in point, which you may know has been made out to be secluded, isolated, insular, and therefore unique. Whereas, as I have shown in my book, there is massive evidence, over 2,000 formative of Kashmiri history for her extensive connected histories with the entire rest of India, not just one or two parts, but going as far south as Tamilakam or Assam in the east or Malwa and Saurashtra in the west, and across time, not just, and also processually. Kashmir actually partakes of many founding social, material, and cultural and political formations that the rest of India also did. I won't go into details of that here, but the point I'm making is that despite this massive evidence, there has been complete, and I dare say willful or very politically convenient silence about this long durée historical Indic identity of Kashmir. So clearly there is an urgent need for reappraisal how we have been representing both our regions in history and the supra region called India, by whatever name. This may sound like a nationalist project, but I prefer to see it as a project that would do justice to and make sense of the wealth of historical evidence at hand, and also the multidimensionality of this phenomenon called India, which its history should surely be duty-bound to reflect, capture, and to explain. So to summarize, the challenges and opportunities both for Indian historiography right now, perhaps revolve around these very silences, omissions, elisions, and erasures in our pedagogy and our research. Whether these relate to the exclusion of histories of some regions, like Kashmir on the one hand and the Northeast on the other, the different parts of the Northeast, we just don't teach them. And we don't teach them because we're not researching them. Or whether it is the neglect of the life history of India as a whole, or whether it is the need for reclamation of endogenous modes of history writing and their restitution at the international high table of academia. I repeat, not out of any provincialism or jingoism, but with a view to enriching, as it surely will, international discourse on the discipline of history. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor Shonaleeka ji. It was an awesome lecture.
That was magnificent. I'm just